Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast. And to this episode of HR, We Have a Problem. I'm your host, Stacey Harris. In this episode, we're going to unpack the challenges and opportunities HR has in taking ownership of their extended workforce conversation, or contingent workforce management, depending on what you call it. HR is notorious for either ignoring or oversimplifying the impact of extended workforces within their organizations. But recent challenges due to the pandemic, ongoing labor shortages, have placed this topic front and center for HR leaders. Joining me today are two experts in managing extended workforces. She is the Vice President of Shared Services at ChristianaCare, one of the fastest growing not-for-profit regional healthcare systems in the U.S., an industry expert who has done it all from HR specialist to analyst, all the way up to HRS team leader. Please welcome to our show, Dana Parker.
Thank you for having me, Stacey.
Also joining us to share powerful insights that can help you make stronger decisions for your organization this year, he is the co-founder and Chief Operations Officer at Utmost, former Senior Vice President of Platform Technology at Workday, who led product management and product strategy as Workday grew from $15 million to a $2 billion company. Please welcome to the show, Dan Beck.
Great to be here, Stacey. Nice to be here with you also, Dana.
Dana, first off, thank you so much for all the hard work that we know the healthcare industry has been putting in over the last 2 years. We know it has been a lot of heartache, a lot of overwork. Not only has the healthcare industry been impacted over the last few years as far as their workforce goes, but we also know that the way the industry has worked has changed as well. For our listeners who may not be familiar with the demands of workforce planning in the healthcare space, could you provide a little bit of background on ChristianaCare, their extended workforce, and the challenges your organizations have been facing?
Absolutely. First, thank you so much for having me here to talk about extended workforce. So ChristianaCare has 13,000 plus employees and 128 plus facilities that are ambulatory or ancillary services within the community and Mid-Atlantic region. We also have about 10,000 extended workforce. And a lot of people don't know healthcare has a lot of different people moving in and outside of the four walls, like community physicians, agency workers, traveling nurses, consultants, as well as volunteers, and we have students completing their clinicals. We've been in the throes of this pandemic for so long, and it's almost been through phases where we've had to change our staffing and pivot in different directions. At first, we shut down services in order to make sure that we were going to be able to provide for the community. We had staff that were sent home because nobody was coming into the hospital. Everybody was sort of scared. We then had the ICUs and other floors really needing support. So we put together a redeployment center. We called all of our retirees to say if we needed their support, would they come back? We had all of the employees that were sent home on paid leave to come back in. And then that first wave ended. Redeployment was no longer an option because people were waiting to come in to get services. And so all of a sudden we went into wave 2 and resources were not as abundant. And so we had to change how we were going to staff that. And we started to turn towards agency. We also pulled on anybody who had nursing capabilities within the organization. And our CNO put together a program to redeploy anybody that had the proper license and so they could provide patient care.
I was just going to say CNO is Chief Nursing Officer, right? Is that what that?
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
I think everybody knows about the nursing staffage shortage that we're having. Basically, the price for a traveling nurse shot through the roof because all of the temporary agencies were paying top dollar and charging top dollar essentially and more, right? And that today is still a challenging issue between bedside nurse and a traveling nurse sitting right beside them working and how they're being compensated. essentially healthcare really had to utilize that labor in order to continue to be able to provide services.
What a amazing amount of both thinking about the numbers you needed as well as the skills you needed and the challenges. You have almost more contingent or extended workforce than you do actual employees in your organization.
It's just shy of being equivalent on both sides. So we have about 75% contingent or extended workforce.
Wow. Okay. That is amazing.
I want to add one more piece. We had challenges around skill mix. Identifying transferable skills and systems is a critical component of this to understand what is the skills that we have in the mix and how do we redeploy them and place those individuals where they're needed the most. At one point in the Omicron, we had over 800 people out of work because they were ill. When you have 13,000 people, 800 people being out due to Omicron was pretty serious. And we were having a 50% positivity rate, and we were testing about 200 caregivers a day. So 50% positivity rate, you're losing 100 employees at the same time. You're gaining some back. And we put in new programs in order to really return them as fast as the CDC would allow and also be very safe and make sure that we were keeping our population safe.
Dan, hearing what Dana spoke about in terms of challenges and all the things she's trying to deal with, both in numbers and fluctuations and locations of workers, are those similar to the things that you've been researching as well as the things you're hearing from other customers you work with? You manage a platform that helps organizations in this space.
Yeah, that's right. I would say it's really consistent. The nature of Christiana Care's populations really blew my mind. I mean, first you have this near 75% mix of non-employees to employees, which is a higher proportion than you would expect, probably in general, but certainly in healthcare delivery. But it's the tapestry, it's the skills, it's the nature of the workforce that really captivates your imagination. And I think we'll look to Dana to tell us a little bit more about some of those populations, because it gets very nuanced. As there is a life cycle for a typical employee within an organization, you can think of each of those half dozen categories that Dana described earlier having their own distinct life cycle, their own distinct needs. Who gets what from a provisioning, who gets a badge, who has access to an ER, et cetera. But yeah, it's very consistent. I'd say the one stat that really captivates my attention, Stacey, is that whatever the size of the non-employee population is, reliably less than 10% of their working population of non-employees is captured in any system of record. So you literally have armies of workers and work getting done in spreadsheets, in different systems all over large organizations. And that really is a market opportunity that we set out to help customers solve.
Yeah, I know our data says, and there's different numbers across the market, but over 80 to 90% of organizations are leveraging some form of extended workforce, right? Whether that's contractors or labor who's being hired under a statement of work, those type of things. This is not just a conversation for big organizations. This is a conversation for organizations of every size and every industry that we're talking about. Dana, you put this extended workforce platform, as we're calling it, right, in place to help you manage this prior to the pandemic. It was something I think you guys were working on even before the healthcare industry went through this major transformation. And you had mentioned that before that, everything was sort of individually done across the organization. Can you talk a little bit about how the shifts that have taken place in the pandemic, did this system help you actually survive the pandemic, maybe in a little different way than some of your counterparts who don't have an application?
Prior to the pandemic, we recognized we needed the ability to view human capital in its totality. We were sunsetting our homegrown solution, which wasn't a lot more than Excel spreadsheets, but it was absolutely a system. And one of our challenges with that system was that it was not very transparent. Managers really had challenges on making sure we knew who was still here, who was being onboarded. And one of our main goals was to make sure that we provided transparency and that we made this really simple. And as we got into it, our extended workforce is really broad. Our students, for example, had a whole other process around it of how we were going to get them into our systems and make them go through the proper channels, collect the right information that we needed for their clinicals. versus how we were going to allow somebody access or provisioning to our systems from an agency. How do we make sure that when somebody's here, they have the right access, and when they're not here anymore, that we turn off that access? One of our additional challenges that we had in our systems implementation was that we have over 1,000 extended workforce that actually work for us too. So they have dual roles. Example, we have patient care techs that are attending nursing school. And so they're coming in to do their clinicals. We have community providers that want to upkeep maybe acute care skills. And so they come into moonlight in our facilities as providers. We have people that might work in IT that decide they're also an EMT on the side. The challenges that we had were, how do we keep track of multiple roles? And Utmost had a system that we implemented, had a single worker component that allowed for dual roles and allowed us to keep track. A big issue, right, that we always need to be conscientious of is when you leave our employment from maybe an employee or a contingent workforce, we don't want to impact the other security access to systems and facilities that you have for the other role. You always want to make sure a provider who is maybe going out and having their own practice or already has their own practice and is leaving us as an employee, they could be in the elevator going up to perform surgery. And we have to make sure that their system access stays intact so that we don't impact patient care. Now that we have a system implemented, we're able to gain insights into the data around our population. And so knowing 20% of our nurses are traveling nurses, that's a big thing for us. I don't think we had line of sight of that before. Now we're able to really understand how we're using the labor, what labor is inside the four walls. And we've implemented an MSP provider to centralize all of the vendors that we were using for all of our agency labor.
That's a huge number, 20%, right? And so not only were you able to maybe move a little bit faster, it sounds like, but you're also thinking differently about your workforce now, right? Because you know the data is what I'm hearing, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
You're putting a business hat on at the same time as thinking about the skills, at the same time as thinking about what we would consider HR challenges in many cases, but they're really enterprise challenges about everything that an organization is making decisions about. Dan, you've been in this industry for a long time. I've always been impressed with the fact that you weren't always just thinking about what HR or really what anybody was needing from their HR data today, but what the horizon might look like, what they might need going forward. Can you talk a little bit about, this shift from spreadsheets and individual point solutions to maybe combining that data into a single platform? What is it that you think that is different about how organizations or need to think about their extended workforces? And why aren't the current vendor management systems, as we think about them, right, meeting those needs right now?
Every time someone says, you've got great expertise, you run the risk of sounding really old. But I will take the compliment there, Stacey. And I think Dana is too polite to say this about herself, but essentially, she implemented a new enterprise-grade system for her extended workforce mid-pandemic, which is really an amazing accomplishment given everything else that she and her team had going at ChristianaCare. But to your question, I'd say you have to go the origin story of this market, which is really quite interesting and is very different than where we are today. For those of you listening to this podcast that are old enough to remember the Y2K challenge, back up in your mind to when we were all running around trying to go from 2-digit date strings to 4-digit date strings. So, year, century.
Just taking us back a little ways, just so you know.
Taking us back, right? I've got a great deal for a Y2K shelter in the backyard if you're so inclined. But what happened in that period, that was the origin story of the vendor management system market, which was because the consultants and the technical resources, primarily in big banks and folks that needed to update their mainframe systems and others, can I get some COBOL programmers in here? They were increasing their bill rates by astronomical amounts. 2x, 3x, 5x was not uncommon. And so the leaders at these primarily financial institutions were like, this is unacceptable. We need to do something. We need to solve this Y2K challenge, but we need to do something to control these rates. And therein, the vendor management system was born. The V in VMS says it all. It's about cramming down vendors who are bringing you contingent workers to do certain projects. And it was purely a cost kind of spend management exercise, less of a talent exercise, less of a let's get work done exercise. That's the origin story for the two market leaders today in this space, SAP Fieldglass and Beeline. Like they started in 98 and 99 respectively. That was the origin story, and that was about 2% of the global working population. Fast forward today, approaching half of the global working population, 47%, according to Ardent Partners, is composed of non-employee labor. Now, you just heard Dana describe their vastly interesting populations, and that's like 75% of their population, right, compared to employees. And so the nature of, I'd say, this market has evolved to the point that, back to your question, to the point that the systems designed to cram down rates in circa 1999 for a 2% sliver of the working population really weren't designed for what's happening today. Travelers, physicians, you name it in healthcare. In Dana's case, we just had a customer go live with 34,000 extended workers 2 weeks ago across 80 countries. I mean, it's every aspect of work getting done. Companies are not just kind of complemented by non-employees. They are dependent upon non-employee labor. And that's what's really different. Now it's about getting work done. Now it's about prosecuting your business. And we're finding more and more executives like Dana that are having the right mindset to say, wait a second, if 75% of my working population is non-employee, should I pay attention to that? That's why I love this podcast. HR, we have a problem, right? You're the chief people officer. Did you know half your working population or more are non-employee? Should you pay attention to them?
And we've been talking about this for a while, right? This issue with the fact that HR doesn't feel like they want to take ownership of this, right? One of the things that I'm floored about, Dana, that Dan just mentioned is that you've managed to do this implementation in the middle of the pandemic, right? Like, I think just saying that a couple of times is probably important. As an HR professional, can you maybe give some idea to the audience about, one, how did you get the organization to basically buy into the fact that this needed to be a central conversation? And what were some of the lessons you learned? Because I know this is a scary topic for a lot of HR professionals, right?
I think the pivot point for us on going after our extended workforce was systems. Our system that was homegrown was being sunset. And so that was the entry point for us. And as we got into really understanding what was involved in our extended workforce, and as I said a little bit before, the broad base of how many and the different experiences we needed, it's sort of like peeling back an onion. As we peel back a layer, we start to understand it and we start to have a conversation around it. And that was how we implemented a team that is now the business liaison between our MSP provider and our managers to fill a gap that we weren't necessarily as aware of before. There's even more that comes in, talking with financials. How is this impacting our labor? How is this impacting total cost of care? There's a lot of little pieces that we're trying to understand. And I want to say we're getting buy-in incrementally. This isn't like one big conversation and we're deciding a whole roadmap. This is an ideal state that we want to be in futuristically. And then as we're charting out the path towards that, understanding how we need to move and shake in order to get to that vision.
Wow. That's an amazing story, I think, of both collaboration and business savvy is what I would say, right? It's interesting. On our data set, we ask a question about what percentage of organizations are using their HR technology to make informed business decisions, right? And most organizations right now are running about 50 to 60%. Healthcare, it's at 71%. And this is the type of thing, I think, that really lends itself to that kind of informed business conversation, right? If you have senior leaders asking those tough questions and you've got the data, all of a sudden you're at the table in a different way. Dan, she mentioned a couple things that were sort of how she got buy-in from the organization. But I do think we have to be honest in this conversation about the fact that HR, even oftentimes when they know this is an important topic, will relegate it to an audit function or to a vendor buying department, right? Can you talk a little bit about the laws and regulations and how you've seen the HR function? They feared it or been concerned about it, so they haven't done it. Is that fear valid? And how does whether it's a technology or processes, help them address that fear?
What's the phrase that kids would say? Like, nobody wants to play a game they're going to lose. Like, nobody wants to take on a problem that's like a dumpster fire that doesn't have a solution, right? People are, turns out, kind of busy with their day jobs. And certainly with the pandemic, social justice. Like HR executives have been under pressure, say in earnest for the last 2.5 years in unique and novel ways. However, I do think the best senior execs in HR are partners to the business. And so you find execs like Dana who say, look, this is not about the employee life cycle. If 75%, I've got this giant population of 10,000, give or take, like, don't they matter? Aren't they costing us money? You mentioned the chief nursing officer, you mentioned the CFO. Like, these are the up-level discussions. You start saying, well, what are we doing with our workforce writ large? But yeah, back to compliance and legal concerns. This is one of the number one reasons that companies are reticent to embrace their extended workforce, because they say, aren't I going to face co-employment rules? Am I going to get in trouble? If you're in the UK, you're talking about IR35, which among other legislation has pay parity checks that are required. But our perspective on this is, like, the genie's out of the bottle, right? There's no point where Christiana Care is going to wake up tomorrow and say, you know what? If only we made everybody an employee of Christiana Care. Because it turns out a lot of those 10,000 workers, they don't actually want to be employed by Christiana Care. They've got a valuable skill set. They're running their own small business. They want to work for many players, and they are hugely important to care delivery. Our philosophy on this is we need to empower Christiana Care. We need to empower our customers with very proactive compliance checks, audits. We have something we call the anomaly engine because it's an ever-changing tapestry. I'm here in California. We've got the California data privacy regs. There's new time in, time out, kind of meal break requirements for certain categories of labor. And so back to my earlier statement about the life cycle of non-employees, it is very doable, but you need some software to help, we believe, need some software to help make sense of that life cycle. And are you staying on the right side of the always changing regulations? It's like, what's the ostrich? You can't put your head in the sand and just say, this isn't happening, because I would bet any amount of money for any large organization listening to this podcast that they are like most companies we've engaged with, and we are engaged with some of the best brands in the world, and they have a 90% blind spot on their non-employee population. It's time to address it, and what a great opportunity for that HR executive to have an even bigger seat at the table.
Completely agree here, because, not only do we see that HR, I think, for big companies, right? Like, this is a real numbers conversation, but for small companies, it's a bit of a survival conversation too, right? Like, I know here at Sapient Insights, we basically manage to keep our organization running because of the extended workforce that we have. We have experts who we hire to help us make sure that, Sapient Insights continues to move forward in the industry and the market. Every small business has that challenge right now because we can't hire enough people to do the jobs. Dana, maybe a really good conversation, and I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this, is, we talk a lot about savings and improving the quality of the relationship between the extended workforce and the employees that we have. But there's also this conversation about the skill sets, and that there are a lot of talented people who have chosen not to be in a standard employment arrangement. And you have that especially in the healthcare industry. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the people who are choosing this kind of extended workforce as their career, and how you need to maybe treat them a little bit more like talent instead of a number on a bottom line, right?
I think we're in the infancy stages of that, but I think it's here to stay. So as Dan sort of alludes, is this idea that people are choosing to become independent. I'm going to add another component to this, which is remote has made that even more possible than ever. When we talk about how are we going to incorporate this extended workforce and what it might look like, people have more options than they've ever had before. They can go out and independently become a traveling nurse and sell their services. They can go to a provider or a temporary agency, and depending on what they're willing to sort of what the trade-offs that they're willing to take, offer this much more flexible thought process of how they want to work. And I think we're going to see more of that, not less of it. And I think there's actually generations, like a generational component of people want to work differently. And the idea of working for a company long-term isn't necessarily for everyone. And how are we going to capture that workforce in order to really meet the demands of the business that we have? And remote makes that more accessible and more challenging for retention.
Yeah, without a doubt. Dan, any thoughts on this idea of engaging a workforce that is choosing and broadly choosing to be extended at this point, right?
I think it makes the opportunity even greater. The McKinsey Global Institute would say that there are 100 million professional freelancers globally and growing quite rapidly. If you look at the Bureau of Labor statistics of like duration of employment, as in, how many jobs will a typical grad from high school or college have in their career, you're up to 13, trending up from 5 when I came out of college. And so you start to look at, okay, so 13, 15, 2-year stints, 30-year career, what's the difference of a 2-year, 18-month contingent relationship versus a 2-year employment relationship? So the lines are getting awfully blurry. And what I think is the right mental model on this is, how do you mobilize the best talent to do the work you're trying to get done? And so I think it's really the workers making the choice for flexibility reasons, and the highest skilled workers, you would die to have them work for you. They're unhirable. You have a skill set in machine learning right now in tech, you're unhirable, right? And yet that individual, he or she, they want to go do machine learning projects after project after project after project to keep their skills honed. And they're really good at it. And you'd be grateful to have them work for you for 6-9 months, be one of the best outcomes probably project-wise you ever had. So we think the more forward-looking organizations are going to figure this out. You want to be a desirable place to work for your entire workforce, be it full-time employee or non, because that cycle is going to continue. If you can just kind of back up and picture that we are at an inflection point in the next 2-3 years, as a betting person, reliably in the next 3 years, the majority of the global working population will be non-employee. So if you can get your head around that and you're the chief people officer at an organization, say, do I want to embrace that, or do I want to kind of push against that and say, not my problem?
Well, and I think the balance here is that it can be better for the worker if the organizations realize that they have to have a strong relationship with the extended workforce, just like they do with their employees. Because I think the risk we run is treating an extended workforce like they're not important to us. And then we start treating them like numbers, right? I think there's that concern in the industry that, oh, well, we're just going to have a group that we're not going to give benefits to, or that we're not going to do the right things that we would for an employee. But Dana, what I'm hearing you say is that, no, we've got to really treat them the same. It's just they want different levels of benefits.
Some of the biggest benefits that we're now exploring is oversight and insight. So by centralizing, and I know we've already sort of talked about it a little bit, but oversight, doing that deep dive to understand what are our populations. And then I think we have the opportunity to create different experiences for them and truly start to engage the workforce in a different manner. We also have this insight. We now know data about our extended workforce. Because of that transparency, we have a better handle on who's here. We have the knowledge, for example, of 20% of traveling nurses. We can now start to put together stories. And the other piece is we're well on our journey to things like time collection for them and really understanding payment per person, right? So that we can understand how much is that labor costing us and how does that translate into our total cost overall, and then start to really utilize that labor more effectively, efficiently.
I love this because I have people tell me all the time, well, like healthcare and retail can't do remote. I'm like, oh yeah, there are areas they can do remote, right? Like that you've mentioned this. Thank you. Because I get it all the time, right? People are having that conversation. On that note, I think not only have you guys given us the business case in many cases for addressing this for the HR population, but also addressed maybe some of the fears that we had in the market. And you've talked about being ahead of the curve of where I think the market is heading. And I think, Dan, you mentioned it very well. I think, Dana, you're very eloquent in commenting that the future is this picture, right? It is not that this is a pandemic conversation or a healthcare conversation. This is the future of work. Dana and Dan, I want to thank you both for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me, Stacey.
Great to be here. Thank you, Stacey.
If you want to explore more on how your organization can transform the way it manages its extended workforce, head over to utmost.co and check out their blog, and follow them on LinkedIn at Utmost Software and Twitter at Utmost HQ. If you want to learn more about one of the fastest growing not-for-profit regional healthcare systems in the US, You can connect on christianacare.org and follow them on Facebook at Christianacare. And that's it for this episode of HR, We Have a Problem. Be sure to subscribe to the HR Huddle podcast and tune in weekly to all of our shows.